Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Jonathan Macca. I'm Director of Public Programs of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Delighted to see you all here tonight. We're pleased to welcome this evening's panelists, Ali Narani, Pia Orenius, Dan Stein, and our moderator, Richard Longworth. Copies of Al Narani's new book, There Goes the Neighborhood, will be available for sale and signing this evening from our partners at the bookseller, right over there. A few housekeeping points before we begin. We are on the record, live streaming, and using social media frequently, but do it silently, please. So take out your phones, pull up our Instagram page, our Twitter page, but also silence them. For nearly a century, the Council on Global Affairs has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different perspectives to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. Views expressed by individuals on our platform are their own. They do not represent institutional views or positions of the Council. The Council is a membership organization. Thanks to the support of our members, we're able to produce affordable public programs and accessible independent research. If you like what you've seen here today, I hope you'll consider joining one of our membership levels, which begin at $100. If you're already a member, thank you so much for your support and your engagement. Turning back to this evening's program, Richard Longworth will moderate the panel discussion, and then we'll open it up to your questions via microphones in the room. By way of introduction, our panelists this evening are Ali Narani, the Executive Director of the National Immigration Forum, Pia Orenius, the Vice President and Senior Economist at the Federal Reserve of Dallas, and she's also Senior Fellow at the Southern Methodist University's Tower Center for Political Studies. And our next speaker is Dan Stein. Dan is the President of the Federation for American Immigration Reform. And our moderator is Richard Longworth. Dick is the Council's Distinguished Fellow for Global Cities, and he has explored many of these issues that we'll explore tonight through his book, Caught in the Middle, which was released about 10 years ago, but is available in paperback and anywhere else, digital, Kindle, wherever you'd like to find them. For now, please join me in welcoming this evening's panelists.
John, thanks very much. Good evening to everybody here. Glad to see you here for this very important program on an issue of great interest, which is immigration. No, not so long ago, actually, when Barack Obama was still new in office, it really did look like the time had come for serious and comprehensive reforms to this nation's immigration laws, with a path to citizenship for millions of undocumented immigrants. Well, it didn't happen. Instead, the opposition that doomed that project was a key part of the coalition that led to the election of Donald Trump last year. Trump literally began his presidential campaign on the day he announced by attacking Mexican drug runners and rapists, by vowing to expel all undocumented immigrants, and promising to build a wall along the entire border with Mexico footing the bill. Many Americans, including many Chicagoans and members of the council, were appalled by all this, but as we know, Trump struck a real chord with many voters, especially those in areas left behind by the global economy, and this message did help propel him into the White House. In this area and in others, President Trump has found making good on these promises a little harder than he expected. The wall remains unbuilt and unfunded, and courts have struck down his travel bans on travelers from Muslim countries, but he can claim some achievements, including increased arrests and detentions, and executive orders beefing up border security and easing restrictions on immigration agents. He has appointed immigration hardliners as his Attorney General and as his Secretary for Homeland Security. The first 100 days present an incomplete report card. No one really knows what the next 100 days or the next 3 years will bring. Certainly that comprehensive reform does seem off the table, but in the meantime, millions of legal and unauthorized immigrants and refugees face an uncertain future, as do millions of others who still hope to come here. Cities like Chicago, who see immigration as part of their lifeblood, have declared themselves to be sanctuary cities and have drawn presidential threats because of that to cut off federal funding. So it's a good time to assess where we stand now and where we go from here. Ali Narani and Dan Stein come at this issue from opposite points of view. As an officer at the Federal Reserve Bank, Pia Orenius can't get into the politics of this issue, but she was a key member of the panel that compiled the report on immigration for the National Academies of Science, engineering, and medicine, which is probably the most authoritative assembly of facts and figures we have on this contentious issue. Now, on one thing, Donald Trump probably was right, that our immigration system is broken. Ali and Dan, I'd like to ask you if you agree it's broken, and if you do, how you think it is broken. Do you think Trump can fix it, and what might his new system look like?
Well, no question about it. The system's broken, and there's a very good reason why immigration was a major issue in this upcoming election, as it has been repeatedly in many previous years. The United States faces, like many other countries around the world, the greatest pressure on its borders of any country in modern history. Not surprisingly, global population growth over the last several decades has produced tremendous migration pressure, and all wealthier nations are facing many of the same dilemmas. But for the United States, the challenge is how you make immigration manageable when you have a process of chain migration and unreasonable expectations for tens of millions of people who believe they're going to have the right to come under a nepotistic family preference system that overpromises and underdelivers. We don't have a system that's affordable because of the nepotistic nature of immigration policy. It favors not what you know, but who you know. And as a result, it de-skills the labor flow and brings us an immigration policy at numbers far greater than we need as a nation, and without the skills composition required for a post-industrial information society. The current system makes it very difficult to limit the numbers, and for Congress to set annual caps reviewed based on our national needs and our domestic priorities. Immigration touches virtually every aspect of American society, and while moderating labor costs may be an important priority for Wall Street and the financial industry, there are many other factors associated with why a country would want to limit immigration. The current structure does not allow that. And of course, we would want to make sure that the rule of law prevails. Now, if every immigrant is not legal, then it means that the law is often honored in the breach and not in the rule, not respect to the rule of law. Respect for law is a cornerstone of American citizenship. As a highly diverse society, with a welcome diversity, I might add, the things that tie us together is not a common ethnicity, not a common culture particularly any longer, not even a common history, but to some extent a common language, and the notion of respect for law, that if you play by the rules, play fair, work hard, seek to achieve the American dream, you just may do that in life. But if your immigration system becomes a mockery, whereby people can just jump the line, overstay a visa, never leave, get advantage of benefits at state and local levels, and somehow ultimately be rewarded for having broken the law and not respected those people the tens of millions who waited all across the country patiently in accordance with our system of laws, then what message are you sending not only to intending immigrants about the way the rule of law works in this country, but also about the fundamental notion of fairness, which, as we saw in this last election, is such an important part of the American fabric, the notion of we all play by the same basic rule book. One group doesn't get to play by a different set of rules. That's just not the American way. And so bringing this all back into closure here, I'm supposing you want me to close up here, is that we have to have a system that works for us, the American people, that follows the rules stipulated by Congress, that has the kind of secure documentary structure and interior enforcement controls that ensures that our writ will run from sea to shining sea, and that once again the American people feel that our national self-determination guides how many immigrants come, not foreign despots, not cheap labor users, not employers, not the banking system, but in fact just the average American person who feels right now the congestive and labor displacement effects of poorly planned and uncontrolled immigration. And so therefore, I have plenty of things more to say about it, but that can sort of open it up. I'll just say one last thing. We've had commissions for 3 or 4 decades. We had the Jordan Commission, the Hesburgh Commission, the 9/11 Commission, the Agricultural Worker Commission. They have made recommendation after recommendation. Uniformly, those recommendations, when they responded to the enlarged view of the national interest, were cast aside by special interest pressure. And it's not surprising that today, after the '93 Trade Center bombing, 9/11, election after election, we find ourselves today with a deeply contentious and divisive debate in ways that to some extent reflect the way in which immigration has changed the electorate in a very polarized way. So hopefully we can talk about some common solutions while we're here.
Ali, your take on it. Is it broken, and how?
Spoiler alert, I agree with Dan that the immigration system is broken, and then we'll move on. So from our perspective, yes, the system is clearly broken. It's fundamentally broken, and it does very little to serve the American worker and their family. I think we would all agree with that. But the question is, what does that mean? That means that as an economy, we are not bringing in the talent that is complementary to the American spirit of entrepreneurship, job creation. From a national security perspective, particularly in these days around the sanctuary city question, we are seeing immigrant populations actually be pushed away from local law enforcement because of what the administration is moving forward with. And then, ultimately from a social perspective and the cultural perspective, yes, one of the biggest triggers for so many Americans is, pressing one for English. There's no doubt about that. But there's also a question of, now as the immigrant community becomes a larger and larger part of cities and towns across the country, there are completely different set of relationships that are built. So, we have, I think, two paths. We have two choices. One choice is to go down a path of fear, which, I think that the campaign, the 2016 presidential campaign, was all about fear. It was a fear of the other. It was a fear of terrorism. It was a fear of jobs being taken. We can go down that path, and clearly we are down, we're careening down that road. And how do we get off of that path is the bigger question, I think. And how do we as a country get beyond that fear and have a sense of, okay, how do we move forward with solutions that, yes, serve the American worker and their family, yes, serve our national security interests, but also ultimately serve our national values, our American values of prosperity, of family, of safety. And I think that, as we go through this, we will uncover that there are very different policy solutions to a system that I think we would all agree is broken.
Mm-hmm. Dan, your organization, after the election, issued a policy memo called Immigration Policies for the 2017 Presidential Transition. And this offered all sorts of suggestions: border security, enforcing current immigration laws, reducing incentives to both legal and undocumented immigration, a border wall, implementing a merit-based versus a family-based immigrant system, several other measures. That's an awful lot to put on one plate. Considering the obstacles that President Trump has faced so far, which of these policies should he prioritize?
Well, it's a very important document. It's somewhat granular, but I would certainly encourage folks to read it because it is, after all, a byproduct of decades of analysis and study about how we got in the situation we are in today. If you have 10, 15, 18 million people here illegally, then the question becomes why? True reform, in any meaningful sense, begins with an analysis of how we got where we are and takes a look at those features and factors that led us to the current situation and seeks to then either reverse them or where that's not possible or to do that consistent with our own values to make sure it doesn't continue or recur. And so we opposed the two bills in 2007 and 2013 because we felt they were a repetition of prior mistakes. Most important things that need to be done right now. Donald Trump needs to restore the idea that Congress sets the laws and determines how many people can come in and the terms under which they can enter this country and remain. Barack Obama, after repeatedly saying for 4 years he didn't have this constitutional or lawful authority, changed his mind prior to the 2012 election and began the so-called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program in a manner that we believe had no statutory basis. He then further expanded it with a program called DAPA, which was enjoined by a judge in Brownsville as being outside his statutory authority where it remains enjoined. Bottom line, an expansive executive in this area is highly dangerous. And this is priority number one. And the reason is, if the ACLU doesn't believe that an alien has been admitted consistent with the law, the ACLU will sue and get legal standing and litigate that issue to the Supreme Court. But under historic judicial precedent, Americans who see an illegal policy of an executive admitting, say, 2, 5, 7 million aliens without any legal authority, no court has been willing to give standing to challenge that decision. That's historically been the problem. If you have a rogue executive who basically says, I'm going to ignore the limits that Congress sets and starts giving out work documents, American jobs, and basically an administrative right to remain, you throw to the executive the entire authority to admit aliens without limit. That is not a sustainable position, and Donald Trump needs to reverse and walk back those policies and say, the president has to follow the law when it comes to admitting aliens and not just go ahead for political purposes and admit them. Obviously, he's going to have to build a wall. You've got to give him a little more time. He's hardly been there. As you see with the health care bill, Donald Trump doesn't give up easy. The Democrats do truly believe, and we can talk about the wall. Obviously, the wall is not the only answer, the only thing that matters on the border, but it's become symbolic, and what it means to the electorate is, are we actually going to get serious on the border? When Donald Trump says, I'm going to build Trump Tower, well, there's going to be Trump Towers. So the Democrats know that this is a marquee component of his political cachet. That if you can stop him from building the wall, then he looks like he's ineffective. But the wall is not so important as much as it is restoring state and local cooperation, accelerating the process of removal. So we renew deterrence, ending catch and release, reinstating the public charge bar, and ultimately pushing Congress to pass mandatory E-Verify so we stop the hiring of unlawful, unauthorized workers. So there's about 5 or 6 real priorities. Probably about 70% of it's already underway. But we got 4 years to get this thing done. He's got great folks in there, and we're going to get it done.
Peter, we're talking immigration tonight. You happen to be the only immigrant on the stage. Native of Sweden, I believe.
That's right.
And you worked on this report. It was a very long report, very comprehensive, but it reached some key conclusions. I'd like to ask you a couple questions about that. First, what did you find on the major trends of the sheer number of immigrants coming into the country and the nature of this immigration, where they come from?
Sure. I think on the National Academy's report, we were updating a report that was last done 20 years ago, so it was very timely. We took a very comprehensive view, maybe too comprehensive, 550 pages, a little much for everyone. First, in terms of the trends in immigration, I'm concerned that Dan is going to run out of things to talk about because the illegal immigration is drastically decreased. In fact, the unauthorized immigrant population is declining. It peaked in 2007. The Great Recession is actually a great deterrent to illegal immigration. Lots of people stopped coming or didn't come or went back as a result of the Great Recession and the housing bust that we had. So we have declining illegal immigration. In terms of legal immigration, we have...
Excuse me. We knew that the immigration dropped off after 2007, 2008, but you're saying it hasn't recovered? That
No, it hasn't recovered. And that's been sort of an oddity, and we look at it a lot because obviously I come at it from the economist view, is that with the economic recovery, in particular the national recovery in 2014 and since, that we haven't seen a resumption of immigration. And so if you plot immigration as a share of the workforce, you see that it's not rising, and we don't see the traditional increases, because normally we would see with rising economic activity and more construction in particular, in the construction industry, that type of thing, we would see increasing immigration, and we're not seeing it. So we have, and that's of some concern, and we note that in the report, in particular because of the demographic bust which is coming with the retirement of the baby boomers. So really over the next 20 years, the projections in the report show that immigrants and the children of immigrants are going to make up all of the labor force growth over the next 20 years. So between 2015 and 2035, 100% of labor force growth, net labor force growth, is due to immigrants and their children, because there's a net decline in U.S. natives workforce of 8 million workers over this period, this 20-year period. So we're quite concerned that, about economic growth, the relationship with immigration. If immigration is not going to resume, it'll be much harder to grow going forward.
Take us a bit more into the economic and fiscal parts of this. Many critics say that immigrants take jobs and depress wages for Native Americans, and they argue that immigrants cost us more, especially in tax dollars, than they contribute. What did your panel find?
The report goes into great depth on both of these issues. So in terms of the wage effects of immigration, what the report finds that there's no overall adverse effects of immigration on the wages of native-born workers. However, if you focus on very narrow subgroups, so take, for example, native-born high school dropouts, you can see that in the short run there can be, in certain instances, a negative wage effect of immigration. If you look at prior immigrants, you can see also similar effects on prior immigrants. Again, if you look at groups that are in very close labor market competition with the new immigrants, you see that there's an adverse effect. I mean, that makes sense. At the same time, what the research also uncovers is that for complements, workers that are complements, so, if you're a manager and you're managing immigrants, or if you're the one on the work site that speaks English, or other tasks that are complementary to immigrant laborers, then of course you benefit from immigration. And so it depends on the group that you look at. There are a lot of other interesting labor market effects that aren't covered under wages and employment, if I could just mention them briefly. But there's, what the report goes into great, it shows that consumers benefit from immigration in terms of reduced prices of goods and services that immigrants produce. High-skilled immigrants are very innovative, and so what the report shows, cites research that shows that immigrants in the STEM fields patent at twice the rates of natives, so they contribute to innovation as well. And there's a number of other benefits. They also tend to move to growing areas, which is actually a real benefit, because if you have growing areas of the country, declining areas of the country, native-born workers are more reluctant to move, but immigrants are more readily moving between these areas, which is also an economic benefit. So there's a number of benefits that are, besides the wage and employment effects. In terms of the fiscal impact, I would say what the report shows, so the fiscal impact, anybody's fiscal impact is basically what you receive, what you contribute in taxes minus the cost of the public services that you receive. Public services that you receive is everything from public education for your children to your share of the national interest payments of the national debt, or your share of defense spending. So what the report shows was really that the whole nation is in a terrible fiscal shape. Natives as well as immigrants are a fiscal burden because on net we're running a sizable deficit and we have a very large national debt. But the other results on the fiscal impacts were very encouraging, because if you look at recent immigrants, because they are so high skilled, we've actually been moving away from low skilled immigration towards a mix which is much more high skilled. And because of that, if you look at recent immigrants and you take a long run view, you actually see that they have a large positive fiscal impact.
Alec, and Dan too. During the campaign, this whole immigration question was often framed as a security issue, that we have to protect our borders. The terrorism question loomed large. Is that the key to this issue, or is that too narrow?
I mean, I think that, President Trump ran on a campaign pledge of mass deportation. And I think that everything that Dan laid out there they are the building blocks to mass deportation of 8 million undocumented individuals living in our country. So that was clearly what he led with from day one. He escalated it on December 2015 when he said that when then candidate Trump talked about ending or banning Muslim immigration. So clearly Trump as a candidate tapped into this element of fear. Now, Trump as a president has continued that trend. I mean, today there was a press release by the Department of Justice documenting, immigrants or the foreign-born who are detained, who are currently in federal prisons. The interesting thing about this is that for the first time, to my knowledge, the Department of Justice identified a number of individuals who had committed a crime who were naturalized U.S. citizens. So they've gone from identifying to tapping into a fear of immigrants, documented or not, now to starting to create a narrative of fear directed at naturalized citizens. That is a very, very slippery slope for us to go down. And I think that, where the administration and Attorney General is taking this is they're demonizing a community that is contributing, and they're ultimately going to, presenting the American public with a pretty clear choice.
Well, Dan, do you agree that by going down this route, are we on a slippery slope? Are we creating fear unnecessarily?
No, I certainly wouldn't agree with that. I think that the fear is it can be very rational based on familiarity with events that are happening, and the reality that we have millions of people who are coming here illegally. We don't necessarily know who they are, and it's kind of I'm not sure I quite understand the import of the question here, because we've had 40 years of the highest sustained level of immigration in our country's history. We're running the highest national debt in our history. We're running national deficits every year. Our global competitiveness has declined dramatically during that period. We've deindustrialized our manufacturing base, and we've moved to a two-tier society with no middle class. Public education has essentially declined to the point where states like California that had a great public education system no longer do. And immigration is essentially being dominated by special interests that want to use immigration to moderate labor costs, or now in the case of the Democratic Party, use immigration to pack the polling booth. And getting lost in the middle is the broader national interest here. The national interest is obviously in security, vetting, knowing who's coming in. We don't agree that legal immigration numbers are declining. We don't agree with this economic analysis. Nor do we agree with the idea that if a country doesn't do its own work, who's doing the work? And if other people from other countries are doing the work, what holds the country together? I'd love to digress for a minute, if I could, about this whole question of labor market issues. We cavalierly try to take the position that immigration is good because we make money off immigration. The very first labor market immigration restrictions were in the Civil War, banning Chinese labor coming as contract labor. Now, what was the objection to that? The objection was that having just finished the Civil War, contract labor would underbid free labor. The Civil War was fought in part because slave states wanted to spread across the United States. Free labor could not coexist with slave labor in the same jurisdiction. It's important to understand, from Bernard Manville's Fable of the Bees onward, the idea is if you can convince a person that they're going to be in a subordinated labor status their entire life, and this is their lot in life, and I can read you the quote, "Men who are to remain and end their days in a laborious, tiresome, and painful situation in life, the sooner they're put upon it at first, the more patiently they will submit to it forever after." The powerful economic forces promoting illegal immigration and large-scale guest worker programs are based on exploitation and greed. This subordinated labor is powerfully defended by special interest groups in Washington that seek to prevent the needed controls on the border. And all these follow-on offshoots, terror threats, criminal alien issues, are a byproduct of the special interest refusal to bring the needed reforms decades ago to left us in the situation we are today.
This certainly seems to lay an awful lot of the nation's ills on the immigration issue here. Ali, would you like to chime in here?
So I mean, this is where we failed, and I want to take responsibility for something as an organization, because everything that Dan lays out there taps a very, very clear nerve, right? And those of us who have advocated for immigration reform, we've ignored what the fear that Dan has tapped into. We've ignored that. And we have failed to understand what American workers are going through. We've failed to understand what their families are going through. So for us as an organization, how do we develop an understanding? How do we tap in? How do we better understand that fear, whether it's economic, physical, or cultural? So that's what we've been working on. That's what I ended up writing a book about. And so what it means is that, so just to share a story, I was in Idaho, about 4.5 weeks ago. Met with 70, 80 dairymen in Idaho. What's the unemployment rate in the state of Idaho? Less than 4%. It is a tight labor market. Everybody in this room that I talked to, it was 4 p.m. on a Wednesday in Idaho. 75 dairymen, and they're grumpy because they've been up since 4 a.m., right? But they were in that room because they were terrified about the direction of the Trump administration was taking on immigration enforcement. And I will bet you that at least half of the people in that room were Trump voters. They were not angry because their Latino workforce in a very tight labor market was just a cog in their wheel. They were angry because that Latino workforce had been with them for a decade or longer. So for them, it was not just an economic question, it was a social or cultural question. This was an extension of their community. This was an extension of their family. So we, as an organization who cares about immigration reform and the future of the country and where we're going to go, we have to understand that fear that they have. We have to understand that fear that the voter in Kansas has. Because anytime a Silicon Valley tech CEO stands up and says, "I need another engineer," that voter in Kansas, to stereotype unfairly, doesn't see another engineer. They see another immigrant. So how do you have a cultural conversation with that voter in Kansas? Because that voter in Kansas right now is listening to the Trump administration, listening to what Dan is saying, and saying, you know what? I agree with them because they understand me. They hear me. Well, I can make a bunch of arguments that we understand that Kansas voter just as well. And I would rather work with the folks in their communities who are their leaders from the faith community, from law enforcement, from business, who also understand these challenges and are willing to have an honest conversation about it.
But this is what a lot of your book is about reaching out to politically conservative communities, churches, especially evangelical churches, businesses, law enforcement, that sort of thing, and finding some sort of common ground, which you found quite a lot on this immigration issue. Talk a bit more about this, and Dan, then I'd be interested to know if this jibes with your experiences talking with some conservative groups, and whether there might be sort of a middle ground here between the political extremes where some agreement can be reached on this issue.
We're going to have to reopen the bar.
Okay.
Right.
That wasn't in the book.
Right, that wasn't in the book, right. In early 2011, as an organization, we decided we had to do something just fundamentally different. We looked at the map and we said, okay, which parts of the country are really struggling with this issue? And it was the Southeast, the Midwest, the Mountain West. And these are the parts of the nation that are changing. And and that's okay, and that's good. So we asked the question of, okay, who are the trusted leaders within these communities that can help lead a constructive conversation? So we began to work with the faith community, law enforcement, business. And if you're working in those parts of the country, you have to be working with Republicans and moderates, conservatives and moderates. And what we learned as an organization is that, number one, we had to meet people where they are. Number two, we couldn't leave them there. But what that meant is that we had to change the way we were talking about these issues. We had to make sure that we were flipping the script. We were talking about the impact of immigration on schools from a constructive perspective, and how are principals dealing with this? How are teachers and parents dealing with this? From the church perspective, how are congregations changing? Therefore, how are the relationships within these congregations changing? And as I did the research for the book, I talked to, for example, a Baptist church in South Carolina that was welcoming Syrian refugees regardless of their religion, because they felt it was their calling as people of faith to welcome the stranger. Yes, they were terrified of the security questions. There were real serious questions about that, but they did the work, they had the conversation, they got to the answer. And these were people that, they vote, very likely they voted for Trump. So, that's the conversation I think that's happening across the country. And I think that especially in big urban areas, we have to do everything we can to either project our understanding of these issues so that those outside of urban areas understand them, or frankly get ourselves outside of urban areas and outside of our bubble so that we better understand the folks that are listening to the administration and to what Dan is saying and say, okay, and we can sit down with them too and say, you know what, I understand you're scared. I'm scared too. How do we get to a solution?
Dan, do you find this? Do you get these vibes from Trump voters who might be willing to move halfway on the immigration issue? Is there middle space?
There's like two things I know. One is that Donald Trump is underestimated routinely, and how it can be that an entire class of pundits, month after month, could misunderstand this guy's ability, genius, whatever you want to call it, get himself elected. What is it about him that people can so easily underestimate him? And the second thing is we have become a class-based society. Unlike 50, 60 years ago, most of us don't have relations who are doing, what we would call dirty work anymore. So the social distance between the elite class, the opinion class, and what you call average Americans, hardworking families out there, very long, very large social distance. And as a result, there's all this incomprehension and this tendency to look down upon Kansas, or whatever you want to call it.
Nobody was looking down upon
Well, it's stereotyping. There's Kansas. I've heard you and Frank talking about there's flyover country. And we do have a polarized electorate, right? Democrats represent these urban cores and their wealthy Caucasian suburban communities, and then there's the rest of the country. And you can look at it on the map and see how polarized it is. But the point is, what Americans want is a system that works for America, which is very simple. You have an immigration system that admits an alien with a green card, with the absolute liberty to work wherever he or she wants based on his or her God-given talent, under a numerically limited strategy. So there's none of these games with illegal immigration, guest worker programs, other kinds of subordinated and exploitative programs. How can it be that Donald Trump runs a campaign that says there's labor displacement at a time when 90 million Americans are not in the labor force and labor force participation rates are as low as they've been since the 1970s? Americans are out of the labor force for a very simple reason. Immigrants have undercut the labor market to such a degree that, as Bernard de Manville said, in 1714 again, is a story, an anecdote. He says, it's like the story in A Christmas Carol. Scrooge gets up and he tells this guy, a little kid, he says, I need you to get that prize turkey. And the guy says, no, I'm not going to get it. Remember that part of the story? He says, well, I'll give you half a crown if you bring it back in 20 minutes. And the kid's off like a shot. And in Bernard Van Manville's story, there's an anecdote of a guy who basically, a gentleman wants him to deliver a letter. He says, I'll give you a pence for it. And the guy says, I'd rather play all day than work all day for nothing. That same guy on the next page is apparently doing some masterful race to deliver some important letter, but he's getting paid very well for it. The bottom line is, Pia tries to make the point that immigration is good because it reduces cost for consumer goods, implying that labor cost is reduced through immigration. But then tries to make the case that overlooking the vulnerable Americans who are being injured economically by this, we're all benefiting because a rising tide lifts all boats, and capitalism requires a subordinated labor class upon which the rest of us can enjoy a higher standard of living.
Pia?
And those are the politics and dynamics of American capitalism. And so why can't we just go to a system that admits an alien with the right to work for any employer without these non-immigrant and subordinated? I'm sorry you find it so funny, but a lot of people have suffered in this country as a result of the labor policies that have been adopted. At the same time, we've outsourced all these jobs and our whole mature manufacturing base is gone. And this part of the Democratic Party's political base is gone.
Okay, but Pia is dealing with these labor force issues, so I want to give you a chance.
So yeah, I mean, let's start with the exploited immigrant. So the exploited immigrant comes in, that's a voluntary act usually, unless it's humanitarian migration and they're refugees, but typically they come because they're better off in the United States. So certainly there are exceptional cases where immigrants are exploited at the workforce, but typically that's not the case.
A non-immigrant visa holder is in a subordinated labor status
I let
position.
you talk for a long time.
But that's simply making a statement that's not accurate.
Okay, so immigrants are the biggest winners from immigration are immigrants themselves. But there's also benefits to us. And yes, it's true that when immigrants first come into the labor force, that they do reduce on the cost of labor. And the beauty of that, the beauty of capitalism, is that spurs greater return to capital, which means business investment. So then the business investment flows in. The magic of business investment is that it raises labor demand and it restores the wages. So if you take, for example, a big immigration critic who's George Borjas, a professor at Harvard, he shows that after the Mariel boat lift and thousands of Cubans came into Miami, within 5 to 7 years, those wages were restored. So that is, that the capitalist story can be an ugly story, it can be a happy story. As an economist, I'm going to say, this is how the economy works. I also wanted to address some of the other trends that you were talking about, Dan, that you were implying that they're caused by immigration. So take, for example, the disappearance or the decline, not the disappearance, but the decline of the manufacturing industry. A lot of that is due to, obviously manufacturing going overseas and also manufacturing jobs being replaced by technology. In fact, immigration in terms of manufacturing has actually helped restore and keep some of that manufacturing in the United States, whereas otherwise it would have gone overseas. In terms of the shrinking middle class, most of the studies attribute that, again, to technological change, the replacement of routine tasks with computer algorithms, other forms of technological change, not something that we can attribute to immigration. The decline in the blue-collar wages and the real inflation-adjusted blue-collar wages of men are due to the rising education premium, the rising return to skill, the declining real minimum wage, the decline of unions, and other trends, and not to immigration.
So I would say that there's this very interesting thing that's happening, is that you have this kind of intellectual populism that is, kind of has this flat earth economics sense to it, where, you build a big wall, no goods will ever be that the U.S. uses will ever be manufactured elsewhere. Money won't move, information won't move, people won't move, goods won't move. And, that's just not reality now, and it's certainly not going to be reality moving forward. So, we can have this, kind of intellectual, abstract conversation of kind of what the world used to be like, or we can talk about the future that was going to come with modernization of, technology, of new manufacturing processes, and help people through this process of, okay, the world is changing. I mean, you wrote about this in your book, and Caught in the Middle, which for me was a really big turning point, because it was the first time where I got to kind of really begin to understand the trials and tribulations that cities and towns have gone through in the Midwest as they've changed. And you wrote about this. Like, some cities grappled with it in a very constructive way. Others tried to build walls around their city limits. And the ones that built walls are struggling. The ones that engage in a constructive way and kind of work through the challenges are on a more constructive path. I'm not going to say they're thriving or everything's rosy, but one of the funniest things about the book so far is when I'm on Lou Dobbs' show, and Lou and I have gone back and forth, and our typical kind of banter is, well, we need an honest conversation. So, he holds up the book, and, he had read it, and he says, oh, well, I highly recommend this. I was like, okay, well, this is going to hurt. But, I mean, that's what we need. We need an honest conversation about where we are now and the realities of where we're going to go in the future.
I'm going to open this up to the audience pretty quick. I got one other question to ask, and it's one very much important, of importance to here in Chicago. That's this whole question of sanctuary cities. Whether cities have the obligation, state and local governments have the obligation to enforce national immigration laws, or can act as sanctuaries for immigrants. Give me your two different views on this, and also the legal angles. Can cities take this stand and make it stick?
So I'm both personally and organizationally dead set against sanctuary cities. Dan over there just, exploded.
No, I probably fell asleep.
Ooh, now I'm going to skin. So we're against sanctuary cities. We're in favor of safe cities. Safe cities are cities that have trust between local law enforcement and their immigrant community. This all comes down to the question of a detainer, to a large degree, where a Chicago Police Department CPD officer pulls somebody over for a broken tail light, run through the system. I'm undocumented. I'm run through the system. I come up as undocumented, but I have no other violation. So the officer has a discretion to detain me or release me based on that traffic violation. Now, under the current pressure that Department of Justice is placing, and even what the state of Texas has done locally, there's a much greater likelihood that Chicago police will detain me for my immigration violation. The feds will say, okay, detain Ali for 48 hours. And the question will be whether or not Chicago police holds me past that 48 hours if ICE does not pick me up. The question will then is, what is the impact beyond that one moment in time? Because that local police officer now is seen by the rest of the community as an enforcer of immigration laws. And in both in Los Angeles and in Houston, their chiefs of police have publicly stated a decrease in the rates of crimes reported within the Latino community, particularly with respect to sexual assault and rape. And do we want to live in a safe city, or do we want to live in a sanctuary city? I'd much rather live in a safe city that where everybody can trust that local law enforcement will serve and protect the entirety of their community.
Can cities get by with this, or can the federal government, in the end, force the compliance?
There's no agreed upon legal definition of a sanctuary city. Mm-hmm. Therefore, the problem. I mean, every day, you have one report of a conversation with the Attorney General where he's telling the, city of Austin, well, you're not a sanctuary city. But the problem is, the week before, they were on a list saying, from the Department of Justice saying, oh, well, Austin is a sanctuary city. So Department of Justice itself is caught in this quandary of talking about a political message of sanctuary city, but it's not fitting with an actual legal definition.
Dan, how do you feel? Do cities have the right to take this policy on themselves?
Well, I mean, there's the contentious battle between what we call the California model, which is non-cooperation, not honoring detainers, not checking status at any point, and the Arizona model, which is full cooperation, local police checking status, calling ICE, verify status, and then holding the alien under a civil detainer, honoring the ICE civil detainer until ICE can come pick them up. And then there's the question of states providing benefits to aliens without checking status. And the ultimate end game, of course, of the advocates who want sanctuary cities is to provide all the benefits to people with no right to be in the country, which obviously creates some political dissension because taxpayers would like their money to go to people who really have a right to be in the country. And it goes back to the core of this concept of the rule of law. And it's all fine and dandy. We talk in these very civil abstractions about this concept. But in the end, there's this broad core objection among the public to this idea that the law doesn't matter, that if I don't have to respect the law, I mean, why do I have to respect the law if someone else does? If you're here illegally, you're generally, in the course of it, probably going to be committing several felonies: failure to file taxes, use of fraudulent documentation, or various what they call crimes of moral turpitude, because if you're here illegally, you have to engage in document fraud frequently, and other things. So every time Congress passes an amnesty law, they stipulate all the various crimes, felonies, that are not going to constitute deportable or removable offenses. Now, people complain that Donald Trump's rhetoric gets him in trouble in the courtroom. But the reality is, after the election, when Donald Trump said he was cracking down on sanctuary cities, Democratic politicians went out with a lot of bravado, including your mayor, and said, effectively, we're going to lie in front of the Border Patrol buses, and we're going to prevent them from enforcing the law, and made a lot of other grandiose statements that sounded an awful lot like obstruction of justice. Now, if you don't want to actually check at the point of providing a local benefit to somebody's status, that's probably okay. But if you're actually going to try to interfere with ICE enforcement operations, or a refusal to honor an ICE detainer, then you're actually aiding and abetting illegal activity. And the argument is you can create a safe zone in a city by rewarding and promoting illegal activity. And a lot of people think that's really kind of a counterintuitive concept. And in the end, it becomes basically a political argument, and the parties are now polarized and divided on this issue in a way that should never have been allowed to come about. Cities and states are part of a federal system. They have a responsibility to honor the supremacy clause under the federal Constitution. Federal immigration laws are paramount, and when Arizona tried to pass a law to ensure cooperation with the federal government, this came under attack from advocates and others and ultimately got enjoined. And they turn around and say, yeah, but we still want states to be able to do all these other things in contravention with the federal statutory scheme. You just can't have it both ways. We're either one country or we're not. And states can't run their own immigration program, nor can they stand in the way of or try to impede the operations of the overarching federal immigration regulatory scheme.
I think we can
One last thing,
Okay.
I'm sorry. The detainer that both Dan and I referred to is important because it is a request to detain. It is not a warrant. So a police chief, once they get to that 48-hour window, or the end of that 48-hour window, is breaking the law if they go beyond that 48 hours. There are multiple court cases which have arrived at the conclusion that, again, the detainer is not a warrant, it's a request, and it is only legitimate for a certain amount of time.
I got to
respond.
Okay,
so
very
quickly.
quickly.
Very important point. What local police are doing is honoring a civil detainer. The ACLU wants everybody to look at these detainers as the equivalent of criminal law. They're not criminal law. This is a civil detainer. Federal government can detain an alien under a civil detainer until they're removed for 6 months. Into the Zavidas case, it was potentially longer before that, because under a civil immigration detainer, immigration is a benefit. If you detain an alien waiting for removal, if you detain an alien pending processing or adjudication of an asylum claim, it is a civil proceeding. So when ICE is asking a local jurisdiction to hold an alien until they can be picked up by ICE, they're asking them to respect a civil detainer. And what the ACLU and others want is for ICE to be able to have to go to a court and get a judicial warrant under the procedural process terms of a criminal warrant.
So it's not a crime to be illegal.
Which, of course, turns it on its head.
Okay.
It's not a crime to be illegal. No human being is illegal, okay? I get that smarty pants. I can throw it right back at you.
But I mean, you just said it. You just said it was a civil. I'm just trying to understand.
Entering without inspection is a misdemeanor.
You got him to say it.
Re-entering after deportation is a felony. Procuring a visa by fraud is a felony. There's felonies all over the place. Actual physical presence out of status is not a crime. Okay? In the same way that you are applying for a benefit to stay. It's like Social Security. You're either allowed to be here or you're not. Okay. Deportation is not the same thing as incarceration.
I think there's a couple hundred people out here who would love to pitch in on this. Keep your questions brief, please, and make them questions, not statements. Yes.
Well, that was one of the more heated programs I've heard. Now, my question to all of you is, why would you say that there's been this oversimplification of immigration policy and politics, and why do you think it's very easy for immigrants to get scapegoated for everything?
Who wants to take that one on?
Leave it to the economist.
I'm not sure I understood the question.
There were two. I think it was a binary question.
So that, well, I guess in terms of the oversimplification, what we're referring to there, in terms of trying to identify the economic and fiscal impacts of immigration, there's so many other things that are changing at the same time, right? All these other trends that we talked about. So I think if you want to precisely identify and attribute a causal impact to immigration, then I think you have to sort out all these other trends so you don't get it wrong, right? So technological change or offshoring, outsourcing, whatever it is, all these things are happening at the same time.
Let me suggest, your report, it does run 500 pages, it's long, but there is a wonderful summary online, the National Institutes, that I would recommend people read. Your report on the immigration priorities is on your website, yes. And also it's a bit shorter, and it comes at this from two different angles and with two different sets of statistics. So it's
yeah, I didn't mean to imply causation when I said all these things that happened in the last 30 years that were attributable directly to immigration. My point was that here we are 35, 40 years down the road and all these things have happened. If immigration is so wonderful, why did it happen? And it is very important to understand, at the risk of making somebody smile here, that back in the early 1980s, what we were anticipating was we were going to sign these trade agreements and outsource all this in manufacturing because we were moving into this information age. And the projections were, frankly, for much lower immigration, but that we were going to be training people for these superpower information jobs of tomorrow, high value added, flexible system, computer-aided design, manufacturing, all the R&D was going to stay here. It was going to be a fabulous world as long as Americans got the education and training. The two things people did not anticipate in the mid-1980s. One was the advent of the internet and how it changed the nature of knowledge work. And the other was a virtual tidal wave of immigration, which, no matter how much people may disagree, has dramatically altered the bargaining leverage of American workers and disincentivized Americans. Pia mentioned how immigrants are more mobile. The level of the rate at which Americans are relocating inside the country is at historic lows. Now, why is that? It's partly because business has no incentive to recruit high expectation Americans when they can tap into a foreign labor pool. And I know that people don't want to accept this proposition, but there's a very pernicious aspect to the labor market recruitment of subordinated foreign labor. And why you may think it's scapegoating, you have to understand there are winners and losers in the immigration debate. The winners want to defend the proposition. If you give me 3 slaves, I will make money. Think about how many people fought and died in the defense of slavery in the Civil War. That is how powerful the greed motivation is behind the special interests that continually push mass immigration despite its obvious negative impacts on the labor market.
So a big reason that people don't move as much, especially U.S. natives, are not moving as much around the country as they used to is because they're older. I talked about the demographics. I cannot emphasize enough the role of the aging population, the aging workforce, and the fact that, immigration has a positive counteractive effect on that aging process, which we are right now in the most significant period of aging in U.S. history. The other reason that Americans don't move as readily is because they obviously have more roots in their community than immigrants. So immigrants are more mobile.
So I would say to the question, and to a large degree, actually, I agree with Dan on this, in that people are being exploited, right? And those people are American workers, legal immigrant workers, undocumented workers. And you can define exploitation in any of a number of ways. But the only winner with the system as it stands right now and the broken immigration system is the unscrupulous employer. Because the unscrupulous employer is able to push down the wages of the undocumented worker, the immigrant worker, and the native-born worker right next to them. Now, this is where Dan and I probably differ, is, okay, what do you do? right? Organizations that, that are on the other side of this, they want to end immigration or severely limit it. And, Dan said publicly, I believe, it would be great if we didn't have another immigrant for another 50 years.
I don't think I said that. But I get misquoted every day, so
You guys
you may
do
as well
this all the
pile on.
time.
No, this is actually only the second time I've been on a panel, Dan, too. We'll have to do it more often. So I think that the solution that serves the American worker, the legal immigrant worker, and the undocumented worker is to level the playing field so that people are able to compete for the same job at the same wage, much less the employer who is trying to obey the law because they too are being undermined by the unscrupulous employer. As long as we have a status quo as is, the only person that's winning is the crooked employer. So, either we can have a solution that moves things forward or we can have a solution that is more just the same.
Let's see, right back there. Gentleman in the tan coat, yes. Microphone is on its way. Right there to your right.
With all this discussion of what causes what, one thing that hasn't been discussed here at all are American labor laws. And what are the effect of American labor laws on the decrease in the bargaining power of American labor? It seems to me that our labor laws are not very friendly to labor.
Actually, Pia did mention that in her discussion, the impact on the American workforce.
Yeah,
of various aspects of going on.
Yeah,
labor
there's
laws.
some of them, they're not all about labor laws. Some of them are trends like the declining rates of unionization and the declining value of the minimum wage, for example, those types of things. But I do agree that we have to have, for example, the E-Verify program would actually be a very good program to roll out in terms of getting all workers on the same playing field. Because it shouldn't be the case that, some employers can hire undocumented workers and others cannot, others try to find them. Everyone should really be subject to the same rules. And so the E-Verify program is actually forces employers to run their new hires through an authorization or a database that shows that workers are authorized to work. But and I've done a lot of research on the effects of E-Verify. It's actually a very effective program. The problem is that if you implement it, when you have 11 million undocumented immigrants, is that there's a lot of adverse consequences for families that have undocumented workers because obviously their wages are affected, their employment opportunities are affected, and a lot of them have U.S.-born children, so you adversely...
Radical change in the Democratic Party. And what an employer can get away with paying. And in the end, if the basic law of supply and demand, if you dramatically increase the number of substitutes available in the American labor market, it's axiomatic that it's going to erode bargaining leverage. And these unionized rights of American workers were hard fought, blood in the streets, from 1900 forward, and now it's all gone. And for some reason, a lot of Americans no longer seem to care about what's happened to the American worker.
Phil?
Thank you. I have a question for Pia, whom I've relied on for these issues for about a dozen years or so. The discussion started calling into question some of the attributes we use for legal immigration, whether we put too much weight, for example, on family, whether we put too much weight on family ties, the attributes. What do we have to learn from other countries like Canada on the economic effects of different sort of weighting schemes?
That's a great question. I actually agree with Dan that we should be moving towards a more employment and skill-based immigration system and away from emphasis on, or too much emphasis on family-based immigration. So right now we only bring in terms of green cards, we only give about 15% of green cards to employment-based, and the rest of the green cards go to family-based and a few to humanitarian immigration. And so if you look at the case like Canada, for example, I think it's the reverse proportions where over 60% of their permanent visas go to employment-based immigrants, and then only about 25% go to family-based immigration. So I think not that we should reduce the absolute numbers of immigrants, but I do think that we should move toward immigration policy where we actually have larger shares of visas going to employment-based and skill-based immigrants.
Way in the back there. Young man, yes.
Thank you. After the 2016 election, Democratic candidate Bernie Sanders went to deep red states that voted in favor of Trump and hosted town halls. And he found that him and Trump supporters agreed on issues such as Medicare for all, college education as a right, and raising the minimum wage. Do you think that the issue of immigration could be maybe Bernie Sanders wing Democrats, or as I like to call them, Bernie-crats, could find agreement with Republicans on immigration? And if they do find immigration, do you think that is something that maybe the Democratic Party can tap into for support?
Thank you.
I think that the parallel there is, so let me take a step back. Last summer, the Gallup organization released an analysis of their sample, their weekly sample. And what they found is that, I'll simplify it drastically, but they found that Trump voters made their decision because they were worried their child would not do better than them. So there's very much a function of kind of intergenerational mobility, which I think a lot of those three issues that you laid out, that's what's underneath that. People want to make sure that their family is taken care of by the government. I think those are very different from immigration, the immigration question. So I'm not sure if we'll see an agreement necessarily, particularly because in the same survey, a lot of your Trump voters are living in culturally isolated communities. So they don't always have an experience of living next to or going to church with an immigrant family. But they see the immigrant, the town down the road that has immigrants and that are going through some sort of challenge. So they're left with the worst impression. And that, again, is kind of our challenge is, okay, how do you engage Americans whose communities are changing or the communities next door are changing in a way that you can lead to a constructive solution? And, that's what we got to figure out, folks. Because, again, right now they are listening to a message that leads them to believe, build a wall, kick everybody out. That's the solution. And, I just don't think that in the long term that's a sustainable strategy.
Let me just take a stab at that. I'm the siren song. Just close your eyes for a minute. I'll do a Mr. Rogers. Try to imagine a country where we had a numerically limited number of immigrants who've come in the last 30 years under a legal system that the public felt confident in, had credibility. Now try to imagine this current public debate being a civil discussion between Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, and Hillary Clinton, everyone else. How many immigrants are we going to be admitting over the next 30 years? What's the purpose of immigration? What are we trying to achieve through it? Having a discussion about the future flow is very different than the discussion we have today, because today we have all these people here illegally. Now, why are they here illegally? Well, in 1986, FAIR supported a bill that contained an amnesty. Ronald Reagan signed it, Democrat Congress passed it. We were given a lot of promises and commitments, the American people were, that this was the last amnesty and that we were going to have our borders secure. Didn't happen, lots of reasons why, including special interest lobby pressure. So here we are 30 years later, and the advocates want another amnesty program. They call it other things, but it's an amnesty and then they get to bring their relatives in. Why have we reached a deadlock on the immigration debate? It's very simple. One side wants an amnesty, which they get automatically the minute the law passes, in exchange for future promises of orderly flow and enforcement. And the other side says, hold on, we went down that road before. You got your amnesty before, but we didn't get the orderly flow and we didn't get the enforcement. So we're, fool me once, right? Fool me twice, shame on me. So until the two sides are willing to come together and recognize that some people are going to have to go back home. Not everybody can stay. You have to restore the rule of law and public confidence in the system. That we're not just going to pass another amnesty and then go back to business as usual. We're never going to get anywhere on this debate.
So then, Dan, both in 2006 and then in 2013, the legislation was passed by the Senate, included future flow, right, and included border triggers that, in fact, the 2006 border triggers have been met by 2013. So, yes, in 1986, it was a legalization for the undocumented. It had very little, if anything, in terms of future flow, which is a big reason why we are faced with the problem that we have today.
The 86 bill was an attempt, but it was knocked
out.
But
there was no
We tried to limit future flow. Remember, your organization was founded to try to implement the Hesburgh Commission recommendations, Nina Solar's, to implement the legal cuts of the Hesburgh Commission recommendation. You guys kicked it out.
So Congress has been unable to get, that was a little bit before my time.
You were before you were born,
Yeah.
but I was there.
Congratulations on that. That's why you need a nap. He said it. But my point here is that, yes, we need to balance future flow and what we do with the current population. Then we can have a rational conversation. But the fact is that for the last 30 years, by and large, we've had an enforcement-only system that has spent more money on immigration enforcement than practically any other federal law enforcement agencies combined. So, the question is, again, how do we get to that place of balancing future flow, what to do with the current population, and enforcement? Right now, all you are advocating for is enforcement, which doesn't solve the problem.
As they said in Brexit, it was hashtag out of balance, okay? We want to take control. And what Trump represents is an enlarged view of the national interest, taking a step back away from the special interests. And these are the implementation proposals, including a merit-based system. And obviously, he hasn't moved on DACA. He seems to he has a heart. We don't agree with his strategy. We think he's legally wrong. But in the end, it still represents a more populist vision for what an immigration issue needs to be. And it's one as a global council we all have to recognize is a problem countries are facing all over the world. Our challenges are not unique. We are in the thrall of a mythology that as a nation we've never controlled immigration, and of course we have over the years. During periods of very low immigration after the Second World War, we saw great advances in women's rights and minority rights and other things. The civil rights movement happened. By tightening the labor market, all kinds of wonderful things can happen.
A great recession. That'll stop it.
Yep.
What are you talking about? When was there a great recession after World War II?
The Great Recession.
World War II?
2007, 2008, 2009.
I think the civil rights movement happened in the 50s and 60s.
No, I'm talking about, you can have that
High
to
levels
stop
of
immigration.
unionization, narrow
To
gap.
stop
Oh, wait.
immigration, you can have a great recession.
Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump should be able to agree on the essentials. The problem is they can't agree on what to do with the people here illegally now.
Next question? Right down here. No, this young woman down here, please. Here. Thank you.
I have a request and a question.
A question.
Well, my request then. Look at me. What do you see? Thank you.
The question, please.
Anybody from the panel? What do you see?
Somebody who wants to ask a question.
You're a human being.
Somebody who wants to ask a question. Perfect. First of all, nobody said, I see an alien. I'm not from Mars or from Venus. I'm from Earth. And I am a proud American. But I'm also a proud immigrant. I am not a criminal. Nobody said that, right? Somebody said a beautiful woman. Do you see a criminal here? No. I am a doctoral candidate in teaching and learning because I want to change what education can do in policy for our kids, for a country. And I am not illegal.
Your question, please.
My question is, nobody here has been talking about education. The only thing that I hear about education was from Mr. Steiner when he mentioned education in California used to be better. What does education or education system have to do with immigration? With that, I'm saying what I hear from you is that the implication is that due to immigration, the education then declines, the quality of education. What does immigration have to do with the quality of education?
Well, it's very important to use precise terminology in this discussion. What I'm talking about is a 1982 Supreme Court case that said people here illegally should get public education when Texas wanted to charge tuition. It doesn't really matter what element of the infrastructure it is, whether it's schools, hospitals, roads. The way in which the infrastructure is built out is as a result of bonds being issued, taxpayers, investors buy the bonds, schools are built. All these things are based on projections, census projections, projections of future school-age population, number of people on the roads. Anybody can take a look at our Eisenhower era interstate system and can see that the population projections were way low, that the schools and the hospitals and the roads were not built to accommodate the number of people in the country today, much less the number who would have entered under the Gang of Eight bill. And so schools are going to decline if you have additional children showing up who are not planned for. You have to divide the resources. Then you have English language, limited English proficiency, remedial programs, anti-poverty lunch programs. All these things tax resources. And if you don't have perimeter control in a country, you simply can't plan and properly plan out how many people are going to be using whatever the public, commons elements are, including schools, including education. And so it's just axiomatic. The Supreme Court's decision in Plyler versus Doe was the greatest unfunded federal mandate on local schools in history.
Alan? Sophia?
Yeah, I just think it's a great question. I'm really sorry we didn't raise it till now. So excellent question. I guess I wouldn't take it from the point of view. I would see it from a point of view as this is absolutely essential to immigration, is that we educate immigrants and their children and our own children, because obviously that's how we're going to raise education levels in the future, productivity. I mean, this is the only way for us to move the country forward, is to educate. And especially the less educated the immigrants, the more important the education piece of it is. And if you look, for example, immigrants from Mexico, for example, have very low levels of education, because that's typical in Mexico, the low levels of education. Their children, we have to devote more resources to education. And the reason that's not a cost per se, I mean, it's a cost, has to be paid today, but it's a return. It's an investment into that child. It's an investment into the future of the nation, because education is the one way where we use tax money, but we're going to get a big return in the future. And so it's a very worthwhile thing to, it depends, when we talk about we spend too much, we spend more money than we have a debt or a deficit. But it also matters, it depends on what you're spending on, because if you're spending on things that are going to generate a return and increase tax contributions in the future and increase productivity and growth in the future, well, then that's something that you should be spending on.
So I would just say that, I mean, the education question is you're absolutely right. And there are a few articles today where I think it was sometime this week, about new data about foreign-born students not coming to the U.S. for university. In the short term, people are probably saying, well, that's good. We don't need any more foreign-born students. It's good for the native-born student population to be able to compete for the seats. In the long term, folks who competed for and got seats in our university system, they're going to go to school overseas. They're going to start their businesses overseas. And the outsourcing and the manufacturing, the productivity that we're all kind of trying to figure out how to hold on to in the United States will go. Because people are going to be trained somewhere else, people are going to start their businesses and invest somewhere else. And again, we can pretend the world is flat and that people, goods, money, and information will never move again, or we can actually have a conversation of how to come up with constructive solutions.
I think we've run out. I bet there are a lot more questions, but I think we have run out of time. Two things. Ali Noorani will be signing copies of his book over there. I've read it. It's a good book. I would say that even if I wasn't in it. So it's so buy a copy. Secondly, I think we have generated quite a lot of both heat and light here tonight. This is something the council is trying to do. Instead of preaching to the choir of having just a single speaker, we know there are contentious issues. We know there are issues that are dividing this country. We know that too often, it's almost a cliche, we don't listen to each other. We don't hear what the other people are saying, and this is what we are trying to do. We did it here tonight. I thank you for being a great audience, and I thank especially our panelists.
Thank you.